Okay, hi folks. This is the second lecture this week, and in this lecture, I'm going to. My intention is to kind of give some background to what I think are some of um, the important background issues that are relevant to thinking about racial inequality today. And so we had the second reading that we had today focuses on just the problems that some African Americans experience, especially African American men, with a strong focus on the problem of incarceration. And so in this, I'm kind of I'm not following the reading here, I'm kind of giving a broader overview, but I'm going to go back and just to put something in it, put things in historical context and to give ourselves kind of a historical timeline in our minds. Just remember the Civil War ended in 1865, and slaves were, at least in theory, at least on paper, were now free citizens to pursue their own economic livelihood and so on. And by 1890, I think it's important to bear in mind, and we studied this a little bit last week when we talked about the Great Migration, but just as a reminder, the majority of Blacks in the US lived in the South in 1890. So this is just 115 years ago. And I think that's important to remember. Majority of African Americans lived in rural communities. Here's another picture. This is 1920. And you still have a majority of Blacks living in the South. So this is exactly 100 years ago, really not that long ago. And so conditions in the South were very brutal. And one form of racism that manifested itself in the South during this time were the Jim Crow laws that legally separated African Americans and other non-white racial groups from white Americans, separate restaurants, hotels, and so on and so forth. And the overall ideology, that is the belief system in the South, was a racist one. And in my previous lecture, we defined racism as how one group will define itself as superior, and at the same time will define another group as inferior. And it's connected to racial characteristics, which again are false, which are made up by and supported by that powerful group that has an interest in those racist beliefs. So that's a good way to think about how the Jim Crow laws existed and were legal. It was part of the legal system. And here are just some pictures, Jim Crow pictures. I might have shown some of these last week when we talked about the Great Migration. And so again, when we talk about the Jim Crow laws, we're talking about a set of laws that were still in place roughly 75 years ago. So again, the timeline here, it's fairly recent. It may feel like a long time ago, in the 1940s, 1950s, when the Jim Crow laws were still intact, but really, not that long ago. Now, this is key, and we already studied this, but I just want to include it here as a reminder that Blacks led the South in huge numbers, especially around 1940, 1950, and moved to urban areas in the rest of the country outside of the South. And they, the circumstances and conditions and the experiences and so on that they had leaving the South and moving to the big cities, especially in the North, were very mixed. On the one hand, there were a lot of good manufacturing jobs. There was less racism in terms of, the kind of Jim Crow laws that were legalized and accepted by everybody. There was racism, but not as extreme. However, over time, as I think we talked about last time, blacks more and more were segregated in poor inner city areas. And when a lot of manufacturing plants closed and left these cities and moved overseas, some even ironically moved to the South, that was really devastating for many African Americans in the cities. So the civil rights movement really took off in the 1950s, and the civil rights movement was everywhere. It was probably strongest in the southern states, but it spread to the northern states and western states also. And it was a mass movement for racial equality and a call to get rid of things like the Jim Crow laws and so on. Rosa Parks was a major figure in the civil rights movement. She refused to give up her seat on a bus, and that's really kind of galvanized and sparked the movement in Montgomery, Alabama. There are some pictures of sit-ins, and protests, and so on for racial justice and racial and economic equality. And one of the biggest protests and marches was the March on Washington in 1963. And this is where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Here's a picture of the March on Selma, March 7th, 1965. Civil rights demonstrators attempted to march across a bridge near Selma. They planned to walk to Montgomery, the state capital, to take their protest to the racist governor of Alabama, George Wallace. And they were really met with a very violent reaction by the local police department. So now kind of jumping around, this is very kind of quick, broad sweep here, trying to put some things into context. But there were some great achievements made by the civil rights movement. And one of the most famous gains was the 1954 decision by the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court of the United States agreed that segregated public education violated the US Constitution. So interestingly, if you look at this map of the United States, those southern states, the ones that are orange color here, segregation was required by law. And then there were some states, the states that are colored in green, that segregation was prohibited by law. And then the rest of the states kind of did not have a requirement one way or the other. But nonetheless, so the Brown versus Board of Education eliminated public school segregation. And this was a great victory. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was another key piece of legislation. When I say legislation, it was a law passed by the federal government. And it did a lot of things. It's a huge document. One of the main things it did, it prohibited discrimination by employers, employment agencies, and labor organizations on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And you can see in the picture, that's the man sitting down there is Lyndon Johnson. He was president at the time. He signed this legislation. Behind him is standing Martin Luther King. And let's see, I thought I had them in there. There were a few other major laws that were passed during the 1960s, protecting and mandating or prohibiting discrimination, I should say, in housing and in other areas of economic and social life. But these were two of the main ones against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Brown versus Board of Education. And so it did lead to some progress. The civil rights movement and the legislation that followed led to some progress in fostering racial equality. We could see this here. I just have a couple of quick PowerPoint slides that kind of illustrate some of the progress that was made. And so if we look, for example, at the top two lines, there's the top solid line is for whites, and the top dashed line is for blacks. And this shows the percentage of the population that completed a given level of education. And so in this case, the top two lines, it shows those who have a high school degree, who completed high school. So in 1957, less than 20% of African Americans completed high school, had a high school degree. And that's really phenomenally low. It's just shocking in a way. Among whites, it was about 45%. Now, over time, this graph here goes up to about 2010. We can see that the percentage of blacks who have a high school degree is almost the same as whites. It's upwards around almost 90%. So that one could argue that's a significant improvement. The two bottom lines show the percentage of whites and blacks who completed a 4-year college degree. And so here there's kind of still a significant gap between blacks and whites. It improved for both groups over time. Just more importantly, we're focusing on African Americans here. In 1957, something like 2 or 3% of blacks have completed college, a 4-year college degree. And so today that's closer to 20, just above 20%, while for whites it's just above 30%. So, I mean, one could argue there is some improvement here. I have one more, and we could spend all day looking at statistics and tables and graphs and looking at these kinds of things to try to measure, progress and racial equality. But I'm just showing two here just to illustrate the point that some gains have been made for sure. And this graph here shows that for black men and white men on the left, and black women and white women on the right, progress as managers and professional and technical workers. So these are kind of the higher skilled workers in higher paid occupations. So let's focus just on, we'll focus just on the left side here, and for white and black men. So in 1950, if you looked at the managers of corporations in America, probably about 2% were African American, and about 12% were white. Now that kind of has improved. There's still a gap between the percentage of blacks and whites, but by the year 2000, about 7% of African Americans were managers in big companies in corporate America, compared to about 13% for whites. So that's an important gain. It's not perfect. It's not equal by any stretch, but there are some gains here. And then you can see for professional and technical occupations, there was kind of a similar gain. And the same holds true for African American women, looking on the right side. But now we can also look at a lot of statistics, a lot of indicators that show that economic and racial inequality is still pervasive. While there have been some important gains made, there's still a lot of problems out there. This graph here shows Black median family income as a percentage of white median family income. So the median is a statistic that's used. It's the middle. So if you have, if you're looking at a group of numbers and you have a lot of numbers in there, you'll take the median is the one that's kind of halfway, that's in the middle. So if we go back to 1957, and to go to the left of this, as you're looking at the screen, the far left, it's about 1947. The blue line, the blue square there, falls at 50%. So what's that is saying is that Black median income was 50% of white median family income, meaning it was just half. So if you take the person in the middle, and the median is a good representation of the typical kind of average family. So that's maybe another way to think about it. I just think the median is kind of average family. So in 1947, Black families were making half of what white families were making. Now this hasn't really improved much, somewhat surprisingly. You would think that it would have gone higher. So if we fast forward here to the right-hand side, 2005, it shows that median family income for Blacks is about 60% for whites. So there's still a huge gap here. I think I have just a couple more real quickly. Here's another, and this is probably one of the most shocking illustrations of racial inequality in our society. And this is the rate of poverty among Black children. If you look at the very top solid line, that represents the percentage of Black children under the age of 6 who live in poverty. And it starts on the left-hand side from 1979 to 2011. Now, I know the years, some of these charts I'm showing go from 1940 to 2010. The years kind of vary. I pulled these charts from different sources here. So this one is from, that's why they vary by year. So this is 1979 to 2011. So if we go back to 1979, and we can see that just about 45%, and that's close to half, 45% of Black children under the age of 6 live in poverty. And this line is at least this high going backwards here. We went back in earlier years. Now the dotted line shows the percentage of Black children under the age of 18 who fall in poverty and who live in poverty. Now there's an official poverty. There's a formula for calculating the poverty line. Basically, it's you are officially counted as poor by the U.S. government if your income falls below a certain level, and which is not that much. Something like today, the poverty line for a family of 4 is something like 20,000. So or 24,000 for a family of four. But you basically have to be living in a family that makes very, very little money. Now, the important point here, too, is to compare this with white children. And this is the racial inequality gap. Let's move to the right-hand side of the table, 2011, and let's focus on the dotted line. So by 2011, just about 40% of Black children under the age of 18 lived in poverty. Contrast that with white children in 2011. It was about 11 or 12%. So this is a huge problem. Now, what I think is one of the major problems that many people lose sight of is the loss of manufacturing jobs in urban areas that have had just a tremendously negative impact on many African Americans, those who were still living in the inner city, who relied on these jobs for a livelihood. And when these jobs were lost, it was devastating. This PowerPoint slide here shows the number of jobs that were lost in manufacturing between 1967 and 1987. And so don't worry too much about the numbers here. Suffice it to say, it's a lot. The fact that Chicago, for example, lost 500,000 jobs, manufacturing jobs, is huge. But I won't ask you on the quiz to remember these numbers, but just that, remember that it's in these big cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, Detroit, the list could go on. The inner cities were devastated by this loss of jobs. And you have, a picture tells 1,000 words, this is what remained. You can see in this picture in the background, the abandoned factories. They're just kind of crumbling and rotting away. It gives you the sense of the lack of economic opportunity. And remember that a lot of African Americans are still living in close proximity to these communities where the factories have been abandoned. They're living there because of the historical circumstances around slavery, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and so on. And so I think one can argue that the civil rights movement, I say this carefully, but I think the civil rights movement was less successful at helping those African Americans who lived in these communities. The civil rights movement did not do anything about protecting these jobs. It did not do anything about preventing these jobs from relocating, these corporations from relocating, I should say. And so, if the civil rights movement protects you from being discriminated against in a job, if those jobs don't exist, then that civil rights legislation doesn't do you a lot of good. So this is, I think, my thought. To have a couple more here. I'm just about done, but this is the only graph here that I have that relates to incarceration. The reading that we have for this week talks about incarceration and also actually discusses some of the problems associated with the loss of jobs. I think the authors, Quinn and Wilson, refer to it as deindustrialization, and they talk about incarceration. And so, there's a lot going on here in this graph. Let's just focus on, pull out my pen here, maybe just focus on the top row here. If we look first at all men here. So 1 in 9 men will at some time in their life be incarcerated, spend some time in jail or prison. So 1 in 9. If you look at white men, it's 1 in 17. So for every 17 white men in our society, one will, at some point in their life, spend some time incarcerated. So here is the shocking statistic here. And the reading focuses primarily on Black men. So I hope you do that reading. It's a really good reading. But for Black men, for every 3 Black men in our society, 1 will spend time in prison, incarcerated. And then finally for Latino men, it's 1 in 6. So finally, this is my last PowerPoint slide. I titled this Continuing Realities of Economic Disadvantage. I should probably change that title or have it include continuing problems associated with racism and discrimination and inequality. Probably be a better title there. But anyway, so we have for African Americans, we're focusing on, there are still many problems out there with respect to economic inequality and poverty, as we saw from kind of the graphs that I just showed a second ago. There are problems with what we call petty harassment. Cab drivers refusing to pick up an African American. Surveillance in stores. These kinds of things that African Americans complain about so much in surveys, for example, African Americans overwhelmingly state that they experience these kind of subtle forms of, we can call it harassment or discrimination on a daily basis. There's still discrimination in housing and employment. Although there are laws that prohibit such discrimination, it still takes place, oftentimes in subtle ways. One example, researchers have conducted controlled experiments where they've had a white couple go out and apply for a loan to maybe buy a house or something else, and a Black couple go out and apply for a loan. And they have equal qualifications in terms of their credit and their jobs and so on. And the studies still find that whites have a much greater chance of getting the loan and getting the rental, getting the mortgage, all of those kinds of things. So the criminal justice system is probably, this has been in the news so much, and it's such a huge problem that is integrally part of history, a long history of racism. And so we've all seen so much on the news recently about police brutality and inequalities in prison sentencing and so forth. Discrimination in lending practices, I just kind of mentioned that, but that's another problem. Still inequalities in educational opportunities. We look at funding for schools in lower income communities, for example. The quality of education and the amount of resources is typically not at the same level as it is in wealthier white communities. And so, okay, so that that's the end of my lecture here. Just kind of a broad sweep of things. And so we'll see you guys later.